Hey guys, tonight we're floating into something a little dusty. Literally dusty. Imagine yourself lying back, lights low, eyes half shut, and for some reason you've decided that what you really want before drifting into sleep is to hear about Egyptian tomb robbers. Because why not? Now I know, when you think of ancient Egypt, you probably picture golden sarcophagi, pyramids glowing under the sun, and that one Halloween costume your neighbor refuses to retire. But behind all the glamour of the pharaohs and their shiny treasures was a very practical, very annoying problem: tomb robbing. Yes. Apparently, if you pile a mountain of gold, food, jewelry, and perfume into a hole in the desert, people might get ideas. Who could have guessed? The Egyptians spent enormous effort building elaborate tombs to make sure their kings and nobles were comfortable in the afterlife. They stocked them with furniture, food, clothes, weapons, cosmetics, even board games. Basically, a Costco run, but for eternity. And the whole point was that this stuff was not supposed to be touched by mortal hands again. But as we know, humans can't see shiny things without wanting to grab them. So, predictably, people broke in. And when they did, the state came down on them with punishments that were, well, creative. Sometimes brutal, sometimes bureaucratic, sometimes just plain ironic. So tonight we'll wander through the desert together, past the pyramids and into the hidden valleys, and peek at what happened to those unlucky souls who thought it would be fun to loot the dead. Spoiler, it rarely ended well. Let's start by setting the mood of the time. Imagine the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period, around 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE. The place was supposed to be secret. Pharaohs had gotten tired of building giant pyramids that basically screamed, "Treasure inside, please rob me." So they moved to carving hidden tombs into cliffs. The idea was to keep everything secure. It didn't work at all. We know this because we have papyri, actual ancient court documents that describe trials of tomb robbers. Yes, even in 1100 BCE, the bureaucracy was strong. The Egyptians wrote down interrogations, confessions, and verdicts in painstaking detail. You could almost hear the scribes sighing as yet another group of locals got caught with suspicious amounts of gold rings. One of the most famous sets of records comes from the so-called tomb robbery papyri of the reign of Ramses IX. He was the ninth of his name, which already tells you how unimaginative Egyptian royal naming got. And his administration seems to have been constantly distracted by one scandal after another. Among them, robbing pharaohs. These papyri read almost like true crime transcripts. Picture it. Nervous villagers, sweaty under the desert sun, being questioned by officials who probably hadn't had lunch yet. The accused confessed to breaking into tombs of minor royals and nobles, chipping away at stone walls, and hauling out precious metals. And what did they do with these treasures? Did they use them for some noble cause? No, they melted them down and spent the money on beer. Honestly relatable, but still not smart when you're dealing with divine kings who had the PR department of a god. Now, about punishments. If you're imagining something quick and merciful, think again. Ancient Egyptians were nothing if not dramatic. They wanted their punishments to serve as warnings. One of the more common sentences for tomb robbers was death, but not just any death. Often it came with mutilation first. Thieves might have their hands cut off or their noses and ears sliced away. The idea was that even if they were allowed to live for a while, they'd carry the mark of shame forever, which in a society obsessed with physical wholeness for the afterlife was extra cruel. Egyptians believed your body had to be intact for eternity. So disfigurement wasn't just social humiliation, it was cosmic sabotage. Another option was impalement. Yes, the grim old stake through the body classic. The Egyptians didn't invent it, but they certainly used it. Imagine being hoisted up on a wooden pole in the middle of the desert as a warning to others. It's the kind of thing you'd want to avoid. But again, beer money. Sometimes, though, the punishments were less bloody and more bureaucratic. Some robbers were simply beaten within an inch of their lives and then released. Others were forced into state labor, essentially becoming slaves on construction projects, because nothing says don't rob tombs like being chained to a rock pile for the rest of your days. Now, before you start imagining all of ancient Egypt as one giant episode of CSI Thebes, it's worth remembering something. A lot of the tomb robbers weren't just random poor villagers sneaking in at night. Oh no. Often, they were insiders. Guards, workmen, priests, the very people who were supposed to protect the tombs. Which, when you think about it, makes perfect sense. Who else knew where the tombs were? Who else knew how the tunnels worked? Outsiders had no chance. It was the insiders who had access, knowledge, and maybe a grudge against their stingy bosses. So in many cases, tomb robbing wasn't just petty crime, it was organized corruption. One papyrus describes how entire gangs of workmen, some of them employed by the royal necropolis itself, conspired to break into tombs. They went in at night, hacked through walls, stripped bodies of jewelry, and hauled out gold sheets. The brazenness is almost impressive. It's like the equivalent of security guards robbing Fort Knox. And when these people were caught, the trials had a very particular flavor. Imagine your boss calling you into the office not for being late, but for desecrating the body of a divine king. That's a different level of HR meeting. The Egyptians, of course, framed all this not just as theft, but as blasphemy. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was divine. So stealing from him was like stealing from the gods. That meant punishments weren't just about protecting property, they were about maintaining cosmic order, or ma'at as they called it. And Egyptians were obsessed with ma'at. This was the principle of balance, harmony, and justice that held the universe together. If someone robbed a tomb, they weren't just a thief, they were an agent of chaos, tearing at the very fabric of the cosmos. So naturally, the punishment had to reflect that. You don't just fine someone for unraveling eternity. But here's the irony. While officials were harsh on low-level robbers, sometimes they looked the other way when higher-ups got involved. Shocking, I know. Wealthy priests and corrupt officials often participated in tomb raiding themselves, or at least profited from it. There's evidence that some mummies of pharaohs were actually reburied in secret caches, not to protect them from bandits, but because priests themselves had plundered their original resting places. Hypocrisy. In politics, who could imagine? Let's float back to the everyday workers for a moment. Many of the tomb robbers came from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina. This was a community of artisans who carved and decorated the royal tombs. They lived in tightly packed houses, and their daily lives were recorded on ostraca, little shards of pottery that used like notepads. And if you're wondering what their main complaint was, it was late wages. These guys were supposed to be paid in grain, beer, and other rations. When the state ran out of funds, they went hungry. And when they went hungry, well, a tomb full of golden food trays and jewelry started to look pretty tempting. So sometimes tomb robbing wasn't less about greed, more about desperation, which, of course, doesn't excuse the fact that they were chopping up sarcophages to sell on the black market, but it does make you understand why the crime was so common. We'll glide to a close for tonight's first stretch. So far, we've wandered the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, peeked into dusty papyri, and sat through awkward confessions of desperate men. We've seen mutilations, impalements, and a lot of cosmic anxiety over keeping bodies intact. And yes, beer money was a recurring theme. In the next part, we'll drift further into the world of Egyptian justice. We'll look at some individual trials in detail, the long interrogations where robbers spilled every detail of their crimes. Let's ease into one of the most detailed accounts we have, the Abbot Papyrus. It's basically an ancient investigative report. Think of it as a CSI episode, but slower, dustier, and with more sandals. Around the reign of Ramesses IX, inspectors were sent out to check on royal tombs after rumors started swirling that graves were being looted. Which, spoiler alert, they absolutely were. The Abbott Papyrus tells us how officials walked through the necropolis, poking around tombs, counting coffins, and writing little notes about what they found. Some tombs were intact. Others, let's just say, disturbed. You can almost hear the bureaucrats sighing as they trudged back to the palace to file their reports. And from these inspections came interrogations. Ordinary workers and guards were hauled in and asked what they knew. And people talked. A lot. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe it was the desert heat. Maybe it was the fact that the Egyptians weren't exactly subtle with their interrogation methods. We're not talking about cozy lawyer meetings here. Beatings were a perfectly acceptable way of getting confessions. One trial record tells us about a group of workmen who confessed to tunneling into the tomb of a queen named Isis, mother of a pharaoh. Not exactly small potatoes. These men described how they broke down walls, stripped jewelry off the mummy, and divided the loot. One man got a gold finger ring. Another took some silver. Someone else claimed part of a golden headpiece. Imagine sitting there, in court, listing exactly what you swiped, while a scribe calmly writes it all down in neat hieratic script. It has the energy of a very awkward grocery list. The confessions could be incredibly detailed. Robbers described the size of the tunnels, how many nights it took, who held the lamps, who kept watch. One group admitted to bringing along ropes, bags, and even a ladder. Because if you're going to rob a queen, might as well be prepared. And then, after all the talking, came the verdicts. Usually harsh. Execution was common, though sometimes officials opted for mutilation or exile. Occasionally, a few lucky ones were let off, usually if they implicated enough of their friends to keep the courts busy. But here's where it gets fun, in a tragic kind of way. The Egyptians didn't just punish the guilty quietly. Oh no, they loved a good display. In some cases, stolen goods were paraded around town as evidence. Imagine your neighbor recognizing a golden bracelet on a city official's donkey cart and whispering, "Didn't that belong to Pharaoh's aunt?" Awkward. Sometimes even the mummies themselves were brought out as proof. Bodies stripped of jewels, broken coffins, all dragged into public view so everyone could see how bad things had gotten. Nothing like parading a half-unwrapped royal corpse down the street to make your citizens feel confident in the stability of the regime. And yet, despite all the horror and shame, tomb robbing never really stopped. The treasures were just too tempting, which meant the courts kept filling with case after case. One papyrus gives us the trial of a man named Amenhotep. He and his gang broke into several tombs, stole gold, and split it up like candy. The transcript of his confession is astonishingly blunt. He admitted that he and his buddies, quote, stripped the noble mummy of all its ornaments and then divided the gold amongst ourselves. Casual, like talking about dividing a pizza. And what was the result? Beatings, lots of them. Then, execution. His name survives only because a scribe had to write it down before crossing it off the list of living people. Not the legacy he probably wanted. Now, there's another layer to all this, the irony of priests and officials themselves being involved. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the guardians of the dead were sometimes the robbers in chief. Priests in charge of maintaining tombs occasionally relocated royal mummies, which is a polite way of saying they took the treasures, stripped the wrappings, and reburied the bodies in plain boxes. In some cases, they even melted down gold from sarcophagi to help finance temple repairs. Noble cause, maybe, but still a little awkward when you're supposed to be preserving eternity. This created a strange double standard. Poor villagers caught with a few trinkets were executed. Priests caught reusing entire coffins often got away with it, especially if they framed it as safeguarding sacred relics. Basically, if you had enough political clout, robbing a tomb became religious duty. A neat trick. Now, let's float for a moment into the psychology of all this. Egyptians believed strongly in the afterlife. Tombs weren't just fancy coffins, they were literal houses for eternity. So when robbers smashed open doors, looted goods, or damaged mummies, it wasn't just theft. It was cosmic assault. You were breaking someone's eternal body and disturbing their soul, which is why punishments carried that ritual cruelty. Cutting off a thief's nose or ears wasn't random. It was a deliberate echo. If you ruined someone else's eternity, your own body would be ruined for the next world. There's something almost poetic about it. Dark poetry, sure, but poetry. And yet, despite the terror of punishments, despite the cosmic horror of being mutilated, tomb robbing kept happening. Why? Because Egypt's economic system was collapsing by the late New Kingdom. Grain shortages, unpaid workers, corruption. People got desperate. And in desperation, you take risks. The workers at Deir el-Medina, for instance, literally went on strike once because they weren't paid. Yes, the first recorded labor strike in history. They sat in protest near a temple, refusing to carve any more tombs until someone fed them. Imagine being that hungry. Now imagine staring at a tomb full of solid gold. You can see how temptation worked. Let's float toward another particularly vivid case. In the papyrus Meyer B, we get an account of robbers tunneling into the tomb of King Sobekemsaf. They didn't just take jewelry, they broke open the sarcophagus, hacked at the mummy itself, and stripped it bare. And when they were caught? Well, the text says they were burned alive. Yes, burned. One of the few times the Egyptians opted for fire, which was especially terrifying because fire destroyed the body completely, meaning no afterlife at all. That's not just punishment, that's erasure. And yet again, irony. Later evidence suggests officials themselves looted parts of the same tomb system. So was burning alive only for the unlucky poor? Most likely. There's a strange sleepiness to all of this when you step back. Centuries of kings pouring their wealth into tombs, all hoping to be left in peace. And then centuries of poor, desperate men with chisels, undoing all that effort. Officials chasing them, punishing them, writing reports. The whole cycle repeating over and over, until eventually the tombs were stripped bare, and even the priests gave up. By the time the Greeks and Romans came along, Egypt's royal necropolis was basically a tourist attraction. The grandeur was gone. But those papyri survive, neat little scrolls of ink and papyrus, preserving every name, every confession, every punishment. We don't know what half these robbers looked like. We don't know their families. But we know exactly how many bracelets they stole on a hot summer night in the Valley of the Kings. And that, somehow, became their immortality. Not the afterlife they planned on, but immortality nonetheless. So as you drift tonight, picture the dark corridors of those tombs. Picture the flickering lamplight of men sneaking through stone passageways. Hear the chisels, the whispers, the nervous laughter. And then imagine the courtroom. Stern officials, sweating robbers, the scratching of reed pens. Imagine the punishments, the shame, the irony. And then let it all fade into dust, like everything eventually does.
Or maybe you're half dozing, one ear tuned in while the other floats somewhere between dream and desert wind. That's okay. Tonight's story keeps sliding forward into the later chapters of Egypt's long obsession with tombs, treasures, and the never-ending problem of people stealing them. Because as much as the early New Kingdom kings tried to hide their burials, and as harsh as the punishments could be, robbing the dead just never stopped. In fact, by the later period of Egyptian history, the whole system almost gave up and leaned into it, which, if nothing else, is efficient. Let's float first to the Third Intermediate Period, roughly 1070 to 664 BCE. Egypt was politically unstable, fragmented between rival dynasties, high priests, and local rulers. The economy was faltering, foreign invasions were common, and central authority wasn't exactly strong. And what do you get when your government is weak? More looting. Tomb robbing went from being a risky crime to something of a cottage industry. By this time, so many tombs in the Valley of the Kings had already been hit that the state started adopting a new strategy: reburial. Basically, they admitted defeat. They couldn't protect every tomb, so instead they gathered up the royal mummies, kings, queens, princes, the whole divine entourage, and moved them into secret caches. Imagine hauling centuries' worth of rulers, stuffing them into hidden chambers and hoping no one found out. One of the most famous of these caches is the Deir el-Bahri cache, discovered in the 19th century. Inside were over 50 royal mummies, including big names like Seti I and Ramesses II. They had been stripped of much of their jewelry long before, but the bodies were preserved. Who moved them? Priests. Specifically, the priests of Amun, who, during the Third Intermediate Period, were basically running southern Egypt. And here's where the line between protector and plunderer gets blurry. On the one hand, yes, these priests were relocating the mummies to keep them safe from looters. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that they also helped themselves to some of the treasures in the process. Because apparently, if you're already unwrapping a king, it's very easy to just slide that gold amulet into your sleeve. Now, did the priests get punished? Of course not. They were the ones writing the rules. It's the classic double standard we've seen before. Poor villagers caught with the stolen necklace, beaten, mutilated, burned alive. High priests caught stripping entire coffins? Ah, yes, sacred duty. A neat little loophole. And what about the ordinary workers in this later period? Well, for many of them, tomb robbing actually turned into a side hustle. Imagine being a stone cutter or water carrier in Thebes. Your day job paid in grain, maybe, but a little moonlighting in the necropolis could get you bronze tools, copper vessels, or bits of gold. It was dangerous, but in a collapsing economy, temptation outweighed fear. Punishments were still severe on paper. Documents from this time mentioned beatings, executions, and even floggings in public squares. But in practice, enforcement was uneven. If a local governor needed your labor, or if you bribed the right official, you might get away with it. Which means, essentially, that by the later period, tomb robbing was less of a terrifying taboo and more of a calculated risk. Let's drift into another fascinating detail: how the Egyptians recorded these reburials. Priests didn't just move bodies in secret and leave it at that. They kept meticulous inventories. Lists of which kings were rewrapped, which coffins were reused, what amulets were removed. It's almost like a receipt system for plunder. 1 gold pectoral removed from coffin, 1 mummy rewrapped in plain linen, signed High Priest. And these lists survive. which is why when archaeologists in the 1800s stumbled into these caches, they found mummies labeled with little notes, like luggage tags. Ramesses II, once the Great, reduced to a bundle of linen with a scribbled tag. It's bureaucratic immortality at its finest. But if you read between the lines, you see the irony. The priests claimed they were protecting the kings, but the removal of valuables was part of the process. If a tomb had been damaged, they recycled what they could. Which is a polite way of saying they looted it first. And no one dared punish them because they were the ones running the religious state. Now, let's take a moment to compare the fates of robbers across time. In the early New Kingdom, punishment was about spectacle, mutilations, impalement, burnings. The message was clear: don't mess with pharaohs. By the late New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period, punishments became quieter, still brutal, but less consistent. Some thieves were executed, others whipped, still others quietly absorbed into state labor. The emphasis shifted from cosmic justice to practical management, which says a lot about how much faith in eternal order was crumbling alongside Egypt's political system. And that's the thread to keep in mind. Punishment was never just about the crime. It was about Mot, that balance of the universe we talked about earlier. If the state was strong, they punished severely to reinforce divine order. If the state was weak, they compromised, bargained, and looked the other way. Cosmic order, it turns out, was flexible. Another irony worth drifting through is that by the Ptolemaic and Roman period, tomb robbing wasn't even shocking anymore. Greeks and Romans wandering into Egypt found tombs already open, mummies unwrapped, treasures gone. Some mummies were even used as a kind of curiosity. Tourists paid to see them, or even used ground-up mummy powder for medicine. Yes, nothing says respect for the dead than sprinkling a little pharaoh dust on your wound. By this point, punishments for tomb robbing had largely faded. The grandeur was gone. The Valley of the Kings was less a sacred necropolis and more an open-air museum of half-looted chambers. The cosmic dread of mutilation and eternal damnation gave way to casual plundering. The cycle had run its course. So where does that leave us? In the grand sweep of Egypt's history, tomb robbers were punished brutally, publicly, and with a flair for cosmic symbolism. But they were also, eventually, absorbed into the very system that condemned them. Priests robbed as much as peasants. Officials looked the other way. And in the end, the only thing that really survived wasn't the treasure, or the justice, or even the eternal peace. It was the paperwork. The papyri, the lists, the receipts of plunder. That's what drifted across 3,000 years to reach us. It's oddly fitting. The Egyptians built monuments to last forever, and most of them didn't. They tried to secure treasures for eternity, and most of those were melted down within decades. But the scribes, with their little reed pens and jars of ink, accidentally created the real immortality. Case files that keep us awake, or half asleep, thousands of years later. So, as we close this part, imagine again those inspectors trudging through the Valley of the Kings, dusty sandals, reed pens scratching. Imagine the priests unwrapping a king with solemn faces, sliding a gold amulet into a basket, and writing, "Removed for safekeeping." Imagine the thieves, sweating in tunnels, whispering, "Just one more bracelet," before the guards arrive. And then picture it all fading, layer by layer, until all that's left is papyrus, brittle and brown, waiting for archaeologists with magnifying glasses. Because in the end, the punishments didn't stop the robbing. They just added another layer of stories for us to read.
So, by now, we've floated gently through confessions, torture chambers, and the quiet despair of a worker realizing that one missing amulet could mean losing his hands. Let's move a little further into the labyrinth of punishment. Because Egypt, being Egypt, never just settled for a single method. It always had options, like a grim little menu. One of the nastier ones was impalement. Yes, that cheerful method where the body is skewered, slowly, and left as a warning to others. This wasn't just punishment, it was theater. Picture it, a hot afternoon sun, a crowd gathering, everyone reminded that maybe breaking into the tomb of a divine pharaoh wasn't worth pocketing a few trinkets. Subtle? Not at all. Effective? Very. But, interestingly, the Egyptians also believed in punishment after death. Because if you thought you were clever enough to rob a tomb and then die peacefully at home, the state might still chase you into the afterlife. Trials could be recorded in detail, names could literally be erased from monuments, and suddenly, poof, your soul was canceled. To the Egyptian mind, that was the worst fate, worse than death itself. No afterlife, just darkness. And let's not forget exile. Sometimes robbers weren't killed, but instead tossed out into the desert like human leftovers. The logic being, if you can't behave inside civilization, go try your luck outside with the snakes and sandstorms. A slow, quiet death sentence disguised as banishment. What's fascinating here is that punishments weren't uniform. A poor worker might lose his nose. A soldier might be beaten until he couldn't stand. But a higher status thief, say a scribe caught copying temple inventories for fun and profit, might face execution. This wasn't just about the act. It was about reminding everyone exactly where they stood in the pyramid of society, quite literally. And yet, despite all of this, tomb robbing never really stopped. Because people are people, and glittering gold hidden underground is apparently irresistible. Even the guards posted to protect the tombs were sometimes the very ones tunneling in at night, which says something very human. If you're underpaid, surrounded by temptation, and convinced the gods are too busy to notice, you're probably going to steal the shiny things. So Egypt responded with harsher and harsher punishments, public floggings, amputations, threats of divine annihilation. Sometimes whole families were punished, the idea being that shame spreads like sand in a windstorm. And through it all, the records we have, fragments of trials written by scribes, read less like high drama and more like bureaucratic bedtime reports, dry, repetitive, numbing, and yet deeply human. Because here's the thing. Every robber we know by name, every thief whose confession was copied into papyrus, was just a person trying, and failing, to get ahead.
Now, if you thought the story so far was already dripping with irony, poor workers punished for stealing a gold trinket, while pharaohs were buried with literal shiploads of treasure, then you'll enjoy this part. Because here's where we stumble upon one of history's favorite recurring characters, corrupt priests. Yes, the very men sworn to guard the dead sometimes turned out to be the best organized tomb robbers of all. Think of it as an ancient version of hiring a security guard, only to discover he's been holding the door open for burglars after hours. The priests had the keys, the knowledge of secret tunnels, and often the official authority to wander in and out of tombs without suspicion. Perfect cover, really. And when priests robbed tombs, they didn't just grab a necklace or two. They went big. Entire caches of jewelry, gold coffins, sacred statues, you name it. And the funniest part, if you can call it that, is that sometimes the state itself seemed to quietly look the other way. Because Egypt was expensive to run. Wars, temples, palaces, constant festivals, all of it drained the treasury. So if a little recycling of old royal bling happened, well, who was really counting? But every so often, things got out of hand. Investigations were launched. We even have papyri from the reign of Ramses IX, about 1100 BCE, where long, detailed trial records describe priests and workers alike being hauled in for questioning. The transcripts are mind-numbing. Over and over, Yes, we took the gold. Yes, we broke open the coffin. Yes, we divided it among us. The tone is so flat, it almost feels modern, like reading minutes from a really depressing office meeting. And then comes the punishment part. Ordinary workers confessed and were flogged or mutilated. But the priests, well, it gets a little vague. Some were executed, some conveniently disappeared from the record, and others, well, they probably retired early with suspiciously heavy pockets. Because justice in Egypt, as anywhere, was often a sliding scale. One especially ironic solution the state came up with was reburial projects. Picture it. Officials realizing tomb robbery was so rampant that they just decided to gather up dozens of mummies, strip them of their fancy wrappings, and all pile them together in communal caches, like lost luggage at the airport. That way, at least the bodies weren't being hacked to pieces every week. The most famous of these caches was found at Deir el-Bahari, where royal mummies were stacked like cordwood. Kings, queens, high priests, all shoved together for safety. And imagine the cosmic awkwardness of that. Great Pharaoh A, who spent his whole life building a lavish tomb to prove his divinity, now stuffed into a closet next to Pharaoh B, whom he probably hated in life. Talk about posthumous downsizing. Through it all, punishment remained this mix of brutality, bureaucracy, and cosmic fear. Robbers might be beaten in front of crowds or quietly erased from history. But the bigger lesson was always the same. Stealing from the dead wasn't just theft. It was blasphemy. And in a world where the afterlife mattered more than life itself, that was the worst crime of all. And yet, people kept doing it. Because human nature doesn't change. When there's treasure underground and poverty above it,
Most of these men weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches in the moonlight. They were quarry workers, artisans, or guards, people who lived in tiny mud brick houses, ate onions for dinner, and maybe had a goat if they were lucky. And then every day they trudged past the Valley of the Kings, where mountains of treasure lay just a few meters under stone. Imagine walking by a locked vault every day, knowing it was filled with gold, while you couldn't even afford beer for the week. Temptation wasn't abstract, it was right there underfoot. And so they gave in, often in groups. Robbery was usually a team sport. Workers would form little cliques, planning digs, watching guard rotations, and deciding who brought the tools. Some even had specialists, like the guy who was best at smashing open stone seals, or the one who could melt down jewelry discreetly. Division of labor, ancient Egyptian style. The loot itself was fascinatingly practical. Sure, they grabbed gold amulets and jewelry, but they also took linens, oils, perfumes, everyday luxury goods that could be resold or used at home. A lot of what was stolen wasn't destined for black markets, but for kitchen cupboards. In one trial record, thieves admitted stealing copper tools and bolts of fine cloth. Hardly glamorous, but in their world, incredibly valuable. And when they did get gold, they didn't hoard it. They split it. Carefully. Papyri tell us that stolen jewelry might be cut into smaller pieces so each robber got an equal share. Picture a group of men sitting in the dark, chopping a golden necklace into chunks like it's a loaf of bread. Not exactly the glamorous pirate division of spoils, more like sad ancient accountants. Of course, with loot came bragging. Some robbers couldn't resist boasting. Trial records mention men giving away little gifts, flashing fancy items, or suddenly living beyond their means, which, unsurprisingly, caught the attention of the authorities. Imagine being flogged for tomb robbery because you just had to show off a shiny bracelet at the beer shop. But the psychological weight went deeper. Many robbers believed, or at least worried, that tomb curses and divine punishment were real. Some accounts describe men collapsing into tears during confessions, begging the gods for mercy. Whether that was genuine fear or just courtroom drama, we'll never know. But it hints at a constant tension, greed pulling one way, faith tugging the other. And yet, robbery never stopped. Why?
because desperation outweighed fear. Egypt's economy could be brutal. Wages sometimes went unpaid for weeks. Drought struck. Families starved. So when survival was on the line, a coffin full of treasure was simply too irresistible. It's this tension that makes the robbers strangely sympathetic. They weren't master criminals. They were workers, pushed by hunger, temptation, and the very human belief that maybe
These scribes were the true unsung heroes, or villains, depending on how you feel about endless paperwork. Their job wasn't just to record the crime. They had to copy confessions word for word, write down witness statements, and detail punishments in the driest, most soul-numbing style possible. Imagine the world's oldest true crime transcripts, only with fewer plot twists and a lot more mentions of onions and sandals. One famous set of records comes from the so-called Abbott papyrus, dating to the reign of Ramesses IX. This document reads like a police report crossed with a grocery list. Officials trudge through tombs, checking which ones had been broken into, and then write long descriptions. The door was found destroyed. The burial equipment was missing. The king's coffin was found intact. We examined it again, still intact. Riveting stuff. And then there's the Leopold Amherst papyrus, which gives us trial transcripts. Over and over, you hear the same rhythm. Men hauled in, flogged until they confessed, then their words carefully copied down. Yes, we broke in. Yes, we took the gold. Yes, we shared it. It's repetitive, almost hypnotic, the kind of thing that could put even the gods to sleep. But here's the interesting bit. This obsession with writing it all down wasn't just about justice. It was about control. Pharaohs wanted order. If tomb robbery represented chaos, then long, boring transcripts were the antidote. A written record said, "We see you, we punished you, the world is still in balance." Or at least it looked that way on papyrus. Sometimes the records even name the exact item stolen. Little details like 1 silver dagger, or 3 linen shirts, or a quantity of copper, which is oddly humanizing. Suddenly you're not just reading about faceless thieves. You're picturing a tired man going home with a stolen shirt, trying to pass it off as something his aunt gave him. And of course, punishment was written down with equal care. Floggings, amputations, executions, all carefully logged. The Egyptians wanted posterity to know that order had been restored. Ironically, the fact we know tomb robbery was rampant comes not from the tombs themselves, but from this obsessive paperwork. The robbers wanted treasure. The state wanted transcripts. Guess which one survived better in the desert? So, thousands of years later, what we have are these ancient trial documents, some of the earliest courtroom records in history. And they read less like drama and more like someone's very long nap time story, which, frankly, makes them perfect for us tonight.